Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Workology. Solving problems in the workplace is an HR leader's primary focus, but it's not unique to HR. All business leaders across all industries have to work to solve problems every single day. I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg on the podcast today. Thomas is an author with Harvard Business Press, and as a speaker, he's an executive advisor and has worked with companies such as Cisco, Microsoft, Citigroup, Time Warner, and many more. His most recent book, which comes out in March, is titled, What's Your Problem? To solve your toughest problems, change the problems you solve. It offers a simple 3-step method: frame, reframe, move forward, that anyone can use to start solving the right problems. Thomas, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some background. You began your career in military service and then became an academic. You're an innovation expert and a popular keynote speaker on strategy, innovation, and leadership. That is a lot of different things. Let's talk about career evolution and how you got here.
Well, I'd say a lot of it really started with my time in the Army. And of course, the evidence thing is around getting at a very early age an understanding of leadership and what it means to create results through other people. But what I'd say the most central one for me was really the focus on practicality, because it was in the Army I first realized that we can have lots of great strategies, but if they don't work on the ground, it doesn't really matter. I think both in my work on my first book around innovation and the new book here, that's really been the anchor for me. In the first book, I went in and said, what does it actually take to drive innovation in practice when you have a day job, when you're not in a specialized innovation department, but you have to take care of other things at the same time. And I think that really has been a center point of my career that started very early.
Your latest book focuses on problem solving, specifically on changing the problems that we solve. What was the inspiration for writing this book?
On a high level, it came really from my work with companies. So I've been the last 15 years worked with executive education and advising, keynote speaking, lots of different companies across the world. There was a specific moment that made me realize there's a need for it. That happened some years ago when I was teaching on part of a week-long program for a Fortune 500 company. They had gathered 350 of their top people in the room. You literally had to be in the top 2% of your peer group to even be part of this program. And at the end of that week, when we surveyed the participants what they found most valuable, the answer was the 2-hour session on reframing and solving the right problems. That sounds like good news, but to me, that was a little bit disturbing because these are really talented people. How come they didn't know it already? Why wasn't this something that we all learned, if not in school, then at least in the first stages of when we first start getting into the corporate world? It was just such an essential skill. And that moment, I realized that there was probably a need to create some kind of tool for, essentially upgrading the world's ability to solve problems.
I was searching the web as I was researching for the podcast, and there's an article on Forbes that talks about the top business skill that people need, and collaborative problem solving is really number one. And I think you're right. I didn't go to a problem solving 101 class when I was in college. I didn't get anything like that.
It's amazing to me how it's somehow a little bit of a missing tool in our toolbox. And the World Economic Forum put out as well a report on the future of jobs. And their conclusion was as well, number one skill for success in the future job market, complex problem solving. And that's where I think this is really important, because people are fairly good at actually solving problems once they have understood what the problem is. The part they're bad at is really to understand, what is the real thing we should be focusing on here? What is the problem? And is it necessarily the same as what we think it is right now, or do we need to challenge our own thinking around?
So this podcast focuses on the human resources industry, and we have a lot of listeners who are recruiting and HR practitioners here. Can you talk a little bit about how to apply the problem-solving methodology to human resources?
In a sense, I think when you look at human resources, we are almost the doctors of an organization. Like we go in, we look at the patient, if you will, the organization, and we say, what's not working at the moment, or how can we make the organization work even better? And then we select some kind of medicine for them in the shape of training, of all the tools that are in our toolbox. That's where solving the right problem becomes really important, because I think sometimes in HR, if you're not careful, there is a tendency to be driven by the available solutions rather than making sure we understand what's really happening in our organization. I think the most iconic example of that for me is the story of a book that all of your listeners probably know, namely Who Moved My Cheese? If you look at that book, it's been a massive bestseller. As you know, there's a lot of companies, both executives and HR functions that chose to take this book and give it to their employees. That's one of the reasons why it became so popular. Now, if you look at the reviews of Who Moved My Cheese on Amazon, there's a very strange pattern for a bestseller, namely half of the people love it and half of the people hate it. Like you can literally see, so for some of the people who received this from their managers, that was not well received, and they write things like the management team would be better off just spiking the coffee with antidepressants. There's some very strong emotions here, and I think that to me is such a powerful example of the idea that you have a tool, in this case, Who Moved My Cheese, which, in my view is a great book. But whether you succeed with it depends on how you line it up with the real problem in your organization. The reviews to me reflect that about half the leaders that chose to hand this out in the organization, well, they read their organizations right. They realize, we have some issues around change, and people will receive this book as a helpful tool. And I think the other half basically went in and misapplied it. And kind of, if you think about it, if you're an employee in a big organization, there's a lot of things going on, and you're kind of angry at management, and you feel it's kind of them that's forcing the change on you. And then you receive an unsolicited gift from management with a book that basically says, embrace change and do what we tell you. And so that to me encapsulates really the idea that one of our biggest jobs in HR and learning and development is to make sure that whatever medicines we choose to apply to the organization, that we've actually diagnosed the patient properly first, instead of just falling in love with this newest thing that we may have seen in a different company that looked really exciting. Don't fall in love with solutions. Make sure you really understand the problem in depth first.
So your book is for all different types of problems and problem solving, and the framework it can be applied to any business leader. Can you maybe give us an overview of how that works?
So the framework itself really came out of the realization we spoke about earlier around practicality. It has to be super simple, because the more complex you make a framework, the less it will be applied in people's day-to-day lives. So the core framework I'll offer, and I'll kind of talk us through the 3 steps in it, is really whenever you have a problem, first you frame it, then you reframe it, and then you find a way to move forward. So the first step is quite simple. It's just literally, okay, a problem appears. You just ask the question, wait, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And that might mean writing it down quickly on a flip chart. It might just be in the conversation. But there's a central point here of making sure the problem is stated clearly, because if not, what tends to happen is people jump straight into the solution phase. The problem is that we need to find a budget to roll out a new change management program. No, that's not the problem. It seems that we have to go back and understand why we think that is necessary in the first place. And that starts with just getting a solid explanation, or this can be 2 lines on a flip chart, just saying, here is the problem we're trying to solve. The second step, reframing. That's really when you take maybe even 5 to 10 minutes. You gather 1 or 2 people and you just have a discussion, not about the solution, but about whether there's another way to look at the problem. And that's really, it's almost like a brainstorm, but what you're really trying to do is challenge your assumptions or question if there is a different way of thinking about what we're seeing and what's going on for an HR team that would be in the organization. If our engagement numbers are low, is that really because people don't understand our corporate purpose? Or is there something else going on that we may need to think about? And the third step really from that is about how to move forward, because the big danger I feel of any kind of problem analysis is that people get stuck in they get paralyzed through their analysis. So whenever you have a discussion like that, you need to say at the end, okay, how do we figure out whether our problem is what we think it is? Can we go out and talk to people? Can we do a very small experiment, or other ways of kind of making progress? That's really the core of it. Getting into a very simple habit whenever you have a problem of saying, frame it, what's the problem? Spend 5 to 10 minutes on challenging your thinking and then finding a way to move forward.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Workology. We're talking about problem solving with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg.
Are you tired of putting your professional development on the back burner? It's time for you to invest in yourself with Upskill HR by Workology. We're a membership community focused on personal development for HR. Gain access to our elite community, training, coaching, and events. Learn more at upskillhr.com.
As HR leaders, what's the most important thing we should be thinking about when we identify the right problems to solve?
To me, the core thing really happens in step 2 of reframing, and that is to bring in diverse viewpoints. Because the single best way to get a new perspective on a problem is to get somebody into the room who thinks differently and who has a different background or whatever it is. So my general rule of thumb is that the more diverse you can make the small group you're discussing it with, the better. A funny example I saw in a company that they were in Brazil. Their CEO had asked a bunch of the finance people to figure out a way how to improve the market's perception of their stock price. And they had, of course, looked at all the usual finance levers for it, earnings per share, all of those things that finance people are experts in. And they hadn't really made any progress. What made a difference was that in that room, they also had an HR executive who didn't really, finance wasn't her core skill, but she came in with a different perspective. And she asked, well, if we're looking at the market's perception of our stock price, instead of looking at all the financial stuff, I have a different question, which is when external financial analysts call our company, who talks to them? And what they realized was that many of the analysts, they were redirected to fairly junior leaders who didn't know how to talk to financial analysts. So merely by virtue of having somebody in the room who came from a different or had a different perspective here, in this case, like a more people-oriented perspective, that can sometimes be enough to find a new and more helpful angle on the problem. So diversity, I'd say, that's the core thing to try to solve for when it comes to problem solving.
I think this is a good point to make, that it's not just a bunch of executives in the room. You need to have a lot of different people, or not a lot, but a diverse, like you said, group of people with different experiences and backgrounds. So they could be somebody who just started the organization that has fresh eyes, but they need to feel like they have a safe place to be able to speak up and share their ideas and suggestions.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point as well. I'm sure you may have talked about that before, but the concept of psychological safety, Harvard's Amy Edmondson has written about that, and the practice of figuring out how do we make it safe for people to speak up in meetings. So absolutely, yes.
I've never had a problem with not feeling safe, even to my detriment, to talk in meetings. It's a good thing, but it doesn't mean you always make friends.
That's true. I think the important, I imagine many of your listeners probably are at a good place in their career exactly because they've had the courage to speak up. I think what's important to recognize is that not everybody feels like that. So whatever we can do to kind of open the doors a little bit more widely to participation, that's a good thing.
It's a nice reminder because sometimes you forget if you're kind of already in that mindset. We've talked about design thinking and its application to innovation and human resources on this podcast several times. What are your thoughts about design thinking in today's workplace?
I think design thinking is a very powerful approach. It in my view, and I'm of course thinking of it in the context of problem solving, it's really the discipline that has done the most to try to spread knowledge around the question of solving the right problems, of making sure we understand our customers or whoever we're trying to do something for. I think there's two pitfalls I've noticed with design thinking. One links back to the practicality thing, that many of the tools I see in that space, they're kind of designed for week-long workshops, and they're really powerful in that context. When you are running an annual hackathon for people internally, design thinking offers exceptionally powerful processes. What I struggle with sometimes is to take that process out of the workshop context and into the daily meeting. And that's really where I've kind of tried to focus my work around reframing and problem solving. How do we not make it so it fits into a design context? And the second point is really related, that sometimes when you're talking about design thinking, it almost assumes the presence of a designer. That you somehow have a designer on your team who can help you with part of this process. And in my mind, what I want to achieve with the book and with the tool I developed is really to democratize this. So anybody, irrespective of what level they're at or what they're doing in their day-to-day lives, they can use it at the drop of a hat in a meeting, on a call with a client where suddenly a problem comes up. I don't think we've succeeded until we get to that level.
I love that you're doing this because I do feel like, the data research is telling us that people need help being able to problem solve, but they also need to find resources to be able to learn how to do this. And it doesn't sound like there's a lot that are easy to understand or apply in existence. So you have the book and then your training and support to help managers and HR leaders be able to gain this valuable skill set.
I have very deliberately created this so you can basically learn the essence of this in about 2 hours. And that's because I also how many of us really have the time to take out 6 weeks of our work lives and get certified in a really big framework that costs a lot of money. I mean, those can help, make no mistake, but it just means that, again, we're not democratizing it. We're not making it accessible as it should be.
Can you give us some examples of how problem solving methodology has made an impact in an industry or organization?
I'd say our earlier talk about psychological safety actually brought an example to mind that I think is a really powerful illustration of it. I worked at some point with a team in a relatively small organization that had identified a problem internally. They said, we're not being innovative enough. Like our people are great, but they are not really taking any initiatives. They're not really doing anything new. And so the management team had decided, let's train them in innovation. And they had identified a provider and a great framework. They were having a discussion around how to roll out this innovation training, when suddenly they're interrupted by a woman called Charlotte. Charlotte wasn't a member of the management team. She was the PA of the manager in the country. And what Charlotte said was basically, hey, listen, I've been with this company for 12 years. I've seen 3 prior management teams try to roll out some sort of innovation training, and they all failed. I don't think your problem is about innovation skills. Merely by virtue of having her in the room and from her courage in saying that to the team, the managers realized that they were maybe well on the way to solving the wrong problem. And as they looked into it more closely, they realized this wasn't about skills at all. There were lots of their people who already knew how to be innovative and how to do new things, but they weren't that engaged in the company. And suddenly that led to a conversation and the team saying, wait up, what we need to fix here is actually to show that we care more about our people. So they start bringing their whole selves to work in return instead of just checking the boxes. And that ultimately led them to a completely different direction. They focused a lot more on workplace satisfaction and engagement. And 4 years later, they ended up being rated as the #1 best workplace in the country. So that was, to me, just such a clear example of what a pivotal difference it can make when both you have a bit of psychological safety and when somebody comes in and challenges the current way of thinking about a problem.
This is great. And I'm going to link to some resources outside. We're going to have your book and some other resources, but I don't think I've written about psychological safety recently, but I feel like this is something that I don't think about because I just say what's on my mind. So we'll link to some resources for listeners too, so they can maybe think about that as they're communicating and talking with the different employees throughout the organizations.
I'd recommend Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization, for psychological safety, or just Googling her work.
All right, we will link to the book, The Fearless Organization. Awesome, thank you. We tend to revert to old habits. What is your advice to business leaders on how to apply reframing to the big picture when it comes to problem solving and sticking with it?
I'd say paradoxically enough, it is about applying it to the small picture first. Because I think first and foremost, reframing isn't so much a framework or a big process or anything. It is almost a habit of mind. It is a way of thinking. And that means that if you try to save this only for the annual offsite around strategy, you're not going to be that good at applying it. To me, the core thing here is to start right away. After this podcast, for your listeners, maybe taking some kind of problem that's going on. My team is a little bit difficult to work with, or we have some kind of challenge, and just start applying the idea of reframing, of stating the problem, questioning it, and then finding a way to move forward with it. I think the second thing to add to that is to understand that this is really a team skill. You can learn to get better at this individually, and that's always powerful. But the places I really see this having an impact is when you have at least a couple of people around you who understand what reframing is and how to work with it. Otherwise, it can be very difficult to sit alone in a meeting and wanting to talk about the problem when everybody else is focused on solutions. So those things, trying to apply it to daily problems, to small problems, getting the habit of it, and then finding a way to get a couple of the people you work with on board with this concept of reframe as well, so you can do it jointly.
Reframing is a habit of mind. I'm going to add that as a quote. I feel like that's really, really powerful. So it's a habit, but it's something that the team needs to implement across, not just one individual.
Yes.
How do we know if our reframing that we're doing is effective, or if we're still missing something that's important in the process? How do we figure that out?
You will never know that from analysis only. And that's why you notice here I talk about this as a very rapid process. State the problem, spend 5 to 10 minutes discussing it, and find a way to move forward. The moving forward part is really important because analysis can only carry you so far. You ultimately need answers by testing things in the real world. And that might mean just talking to people, describing the problem to them and see how they react. Or it might mean running a very small experiment of some sort, just to allow the world to tell you if you are heading in the wrong direction. So reframing to me is not about a very prolonged analysis phase up front. It is much more about going in, do a rapid deep dive and say, is there a different way of thinking about it? Then testing and moving forward, and then stepping back again later, maybe a week later, you go back and say, given the conversations we've had this week, what have we learned about the problem? Do we need to rethink what it is? So looking at this not as phase one of a big thing, but more, again, the habit of mind thing, an iterated thing that's constantly going on in the background as part of your normal conversations in a Monday morning meeting setting.
Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Of course, it was really a pleasure.
Where can people go to learn more about you, the book, and what you do?
I'd say the book starting point that's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever you buy your books, is called "What's Your Problem?" And my website is Wedell-Wedellsborg, or will be Thomas Wedell as well. So I have a quite Googleable name. So if you type that into Google, I'm sure I will pop up.
We'll link to his website and the book in the resources section of the transcript of this podcast. Thank you so much. Shifting the way we think about problem solving is a process, and I love the way that Thomas has outlined reframing in his book. I think we should question our objectives and our approach to setting goals in the same way that we change our approach to innovation with design thinking. I appreciate Thomas taking the time to talk with us and walk us through the process on today's podcast. I'll also be including resources to psychological safety in the transcript of the podcast, as well as other things that we mentioned. So be sure to visit workology.com to check out the podcast resources in the transcript. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Workology. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes. You can learn more at workology.com.